Hi, good day to all of you. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world on your Viking cruise connection. I'm James Conlon. I'm a conductor. My principal positions are at the Los Angeles Opera, where I'm music director, and at the Rai Orchestra in Italy, in Torino. So I know a lot of you are classical music fans, and then I know there's a lot of you that are not. So to those of you that are, you're probably going to hear a lot of things you already know, so please forgive me. But for those of you, and particularly those of you that I like talking to, are those who may not be classical music fans or opera fans, and I'd like to engage you and get you interested if you're not, because it's a very enriching life. It's a very wonderful life. I'm from New York. I come from a family of non-musicians. I was taken to the opera by accident when I was 11 years old, mainly because my best friend was made to go with his mother, and he only would go if he could sit in the front row and bring a good friend. So he asked me, would I go? And for that extraordinary coincidence, I fell in love first with opera, then with classical music at the age of 11. And by the time I was 13, I knew I wanted to conduct. And so I pursued that. What I want to communicate to you is passion, that this is a passion. And if you become subject to that passion, it's for life. And it's a very enriching life. I'm never bored. That's many, many years ago. I'm talking about the Stone Age. Now I'm talking about so long ago. But it's a lifelong passion. And I could not live long enough to outgrow that passion. I feel the same way. I have the same excitement today as I had when I was very, very young. So for those of you that have for those of you who don't have any relationship to opera particularly, maybe never seen an opera, and today I want to show you its very human side, because there are a lot of preconceived ideas that keep people away from opera in general and the opera house specifically. First of all, if you've never been in one, it looks like a big fortress outside, and then it has traditional images of people wearing evening clothes, smoking tuxedos, black tie, white tie tails, women in gorgeous gowns. And the idea is that you have to dress up like that in order to go there, otherwise you don't belong. So I'd like to attack all of those ideas. Opera is not an elite art form. It's not elitist in any way. It's for everybody. Classical music is for everybody, and everybody is capable of responding to it, having emotional reactions, which is what it's all about, listening to it, getting pleasure out of it, being challenged by it, being moved, being sad, being happy, being extravagantly happy, reliving romantic experiences through the romantic experiences of some of the personalities on stage, listening to the human voice, which is the basic and most important basic instrument that exists. So it's an art form that is complex. It's based, to begin with, on singing and the human voice, but grew upward and outward, incorporating dramatic values, text, theater, poetry, language. Then as it became more complex, a greater role for instruments, the orchestra, bringing in a chorus, which is of course nothing more than the same as soloists. Everybody sings their experience. And wherever you are in the world, you have some form of musical theater, which is not opera. Sometimes, however, it's related to opera and comes out of the operatic world. So what I'd like to show you a little bit of today is not just what it is, what is opera, and why do I love it so much, why is it so fascinating to me and fascinating to other people, but some of what goes into it from our side. So I brought with me a certain number of slides. you can look at me and with, I should say, you should look with me at some of these slides, and I'll tell you a little bit about them, what they represent. They are mostly slides that have been taken at Los Angeles Opera, where I think I can give you a broader view. Conductors, like me, have somewhat split lives between being music directors, I'll explain that in a minute, and conducting. Conducting is what? Conducting is leading an orchestra and/or chorus or an opera together, and that has a certain function. That is not essentially different whether you're conducting an opera or you're conducting a symphony. I break my life, I should divide my life in two, between the symphony life and opera life. But today we're going to be concentrating on opera. So as a music director, you are responsible for, let's say, all the music and the organization of music, and in many cases the choice of music for whatever organization you represent. So, I mean, I am simultaneously, and have been for most of my life, the music director of an orchestra and music director of an opera house. Now, since we're talking about opera houses now, so in an opera house, for however many months a year that I'm there, I basically live there for 24 hours a day. Not quite, that's an exaggeration. But the job is never finished. And some of that job has nothing to do with actually standing up in front of orchestras and singing and conducting performances. In fact, a great deal of it is behind the scenes. So I take responsibility that every production I conduct, I start from the beginning with the singers and move up through a series of rehearsals which culminate in a dress rehearsal and performances. But at the same time, I have to oversee what other people are doing musically. We have a music staff, we have a chorus director, we have a chorus, we have an orchestra, we have young artists, and all of that more or less, insofar that it has something to do with music, I'm involved in all of that. The difference between that and being a guest conductor, as a guest conductor, you come to an orchestra, let's say for a week, you conduct rehearsals, you conduct the performances, and you leave. So most conductors, like me, have both aspects as a part of their professional lives. So I will spend a certain number of months in Los Angeles being a music director, and then I'll spend another half of that time traveling around mostly Europe and the US, conducting orchestras and giving concerts. So let me show you the first slide, which is a very unexciting slide. And if there you are, that's me sitting in my office. I don't know, really, actually, I never saw this picture before yesterday, but it seems to represent what? It represents the fact that there's a certain administrative part to my job. And so there's where I sit in my office. You can see 2 of our 4 Grammys that have Los Angeles Opera has won over the last few years. But since that picture is quite unexciting, I want to move to the next one where you see a real production. So here it comes. And so that of sometimes the grandeur of opera and the theatrical scenic aspect. So this is an opera called The Ghost of Versailles. It was written by one of the great American composers, John Corigliano. And on the one hand, it has a classical view to it. You'll see that this is taking place during the French Revolution, but on the other side is a very imaginative and varied work. So this is just to give you an idea of the grandeur of opera. On the one hand, opera is often viewed as grand, for better and for worse. There's a picture that gives you the grand view of that. Here's another one. We go on to our next slide. This is also The Ghost of Versailles by John Corigliano at Los Angeles Opera, and this is a comic moment with a cameo appearance. That's Patti LuPone up on top there, who is impersonating a belly dancer at a certain moment in the opera. Again, opera sometimes involves dancing as well. There is a component of ballet in many operas. So I want to give you a picture of a little bit of what that looks like. So now let's move on to the next slide, which you can see. This is the orchestra. That's me up on the podium. You can see a little bit of what it looks like in an orchestra pit. So the orchestra is generally not visible or only partially visible to the audience. That's a convention, and it goes all the way back to two or three centuries ago, where theaters, the first great theaters in Italy, and then moving on to Vienna, to Paris, to Germany, England, and then eventually to America. The orchestra does not play a subsidiary role, but it does not play a visual role, and therefore it's in a pit where it doesn't, where you don't if it competes with the stage, which some people like to see who watch the orchestra, it's because the orchestra is an equal partner to everything on the stage, and the music coming out or emanating from the orchestra is very important. So if we move on to the next slide, you will see another production. This is an opera called Der Zwerg. That means the dwarf. It's written by a composer named Alexander Zemlinsky, who is less known than he should be. He was one of the composers who was suppressed in Nazi Germany. And this magnificent opera, based on a story by Oscar Wilde, you see the beautiful princess, or the Infanta of Spain, and the man there sitting in that box is a dwarf, and it is a heart-wrenching story of the encounter, the love, and it's a tragic story between, well, I should say, on the part of the dwarf who falls in love with the Infanta of Spain. Now, we put that opera together, and we can go on to the next slide, with a comic opera. In other words, two operas in one. And here's just to give you an idea of how radically different you can portray. This is an almost cartoon-like depiction. This is called The Broken Jug. The Broken Jug. That's a Broken Krug, which is an important story by Kleist, which almost everybody in Germany reads in school. And it's a story of corruption, of a corrupt judge, and how he is caught in his corrupt role. It was written by another composer who was suppressed by the Nazis, Victor Ullmann, who spent 2 years in internment in Terezin and wrote 22 pieces of music in that time before he was unfortunately transported and murdered in Auschwitz. Now, not to get too dark, this is just to show you that just before that experience, he wrote this very comic opera, The Broken Jug. Here's another picture of it from our production, and you can see the that's a costumier. So people work behind stage that you never see on stage. This is a singer getting his last touch up there by one of the costume department, and that's going on backstage. So you get a little picture of what goes on behind the scenes, what you don't see. Now, if you move ahead to the next slide, you get another vision of the jug. There we are. This is a silhouette that accompanies the overture. That's the sort of a little symphonic concert that many operas used to have before starting the proper part of the drama or the comedy. This is a fast-moving comedy. It takes 35 minutes, and so we put these two operas together, a comedy and a tragedy, and it was showcasing the enormous variety of some of the compositions that were and composers who were suppressed during Nazi Germany. Now, if we move on, more scenes from backstage. This is sort of a fencing class. Not exactly. All those people there dressed in black are holding sort of will be lighted spears. And this is for our production of The Ring of the Nibelungen, a 4-part majestic, magnificent work by Richard Wagner, which we produced about 10 years ago. It was the first production that was indigenous to Los Angeles. And so this is kind of, you see where rehearsals staging rehearsals go on in studios that you never see when you go to the opera house. That's what it's like when they're rehearsing. Here's what it looks like on the next slide. This is what it looks like when it's all on stage. All you see are these brilliant lights in two principal singers in the middle of the stage. You don't see all those people dressed in black because the lighting and the scenery is designed in such a way for you not to see them, but you saw it being prepared in the fencing room. So here's one view, and the next slide will show you another view that there it is in a brighter context. So once again, the preparation, and I'll walk you through that preparation shortly, all goes on backstage. So let me tell you parallel what I do and what the stage director or producer does at the same time. It begins with musical preparation that is parallel to the theatrical preparation. And if we'll move away from the slide for a moment, I can talk to you directly, not through the slide. How does that work? Let's start with the music. All the singers are brought together. They are presumed to know their roles. They're not learning their roles, although that's sometimes necessary to teach them. We will rehearse at the piano. I do that one-on-one, or I do it in the group of singers, so that musically we develop a relationship. We know what we're doing. We have define common goals. We decide many things. Singer to conductor, what is the tempo, how fast does it go, how slowly does it go, what are vocal considerations that need to be taken, what things do we have to think about together in order to create the best musical effect. Now, at the same time, the singers will start working with the stage director in a studio of some sort with, not with the full scenery usually, with a mock-up. And parallel to my musical rehearsals, we'll start the staging rehearsals. And every day we will take a step forward in between these two, in between the theatrical element and the musical element. Now, at a certain point, I will step out of those piano rehearsals and I will rehearse musically with the chorus. And then the chorus will come into staging rehearsals and we'll continue working together. And I'll step out in another respect and I will start rehearsing the orchestra by itself. That work usually takes several days of intense work. And that at a certain point now, it's time to move onto the stage. At first we move onto the stage only with the piano so that we can concentrate on the production values and the theatrical preparation, dramatic preparation. That I will be present for that, and the stage director will be in command of those rehearsals, starting to integrate the singers and the chorus with the actual scenery, and that takes a certain time. Now we're ready to bring the orchestra together with the singers for the first time, and we have a rehearsal. The orchestra is in the pit. You saw the pit before. The singers are on stage, and we have what's known in the trade as a Sitzprobe. Sitzprobe is a German word which means rehearsal sitting. Basically, everybody sits with their music if they want to, and we go through the entire piece. The orchestra gets to hear the singers for the first time, and the singers hear the orchestra for the first time. And sometimes that's a little bit of a shock because they've been used to rehearsing in a room with a piano. So that's a Sitzprobe, or called all'italiana in the Italian-speaking countries. And having done that rehearsal, it's now time for usually for the orchestra and the singers to all start to rehearse the show as it will be. Orchestra in the pit, singers on stage, everybody singing, performing their roles. This is also where the stage management and the stage crew have their hands full because they are coordinating everybody's entrances, exits, lighting cues, everything that is theatrical. Meanwhile, I have my hands full because I am coordinating all of them for the first time, getting them used to having the orchestra there, and the orchestra itself is getting used to what it means. Opera orchestras have to be extremely flexible because they have to listen to the singing and to somehow make music at a great distance. They're not all seated together. So that the process of stage orchestra rehearsals goes forward for a few days until you have a dress rehearsal where everything is as it will be. It's usually a run through a performance where you perform it as if it were a performance, and then you're ready for the premiere. So as you can see, it's a process of building up the whole of the company, theatrically, musically, dramatically, all together. So if we move on to our next slide now, I've chosen this to show you the great variety of approaches to modern, or I should say contemporary productions of operas. Now there are certain cliches, that have come out of the 19th century, and then the 20th century, early 20th century, with very static theatrical. The soprano and the tenor, the lovers stand and deliver. We call it park and bark in our corner. What that means, they simply stand there and sing, and the theatrical element is slightly secondary. They have their costumes, there's the scenery, but in fact it's mainly about the singing. Now, with the advent of cinema and the popularity of cinema, audiences became more demanding about how people actually look, how people actually perform and act. And so the demands of theater have grown enormously, so let's say in the second half of the 20th century, and into modernity. And so now audiences and directors and conductors alike expect a theatrically more sophisticated and more varied approach, so that it's not just singing on stage with an orchestra, it becomes a theatrical event in and of itself. This is a very imaginative production, which has, I think, been played all over the world, of the magic flute, which was based on the idea of a silent film. And so you see the characters. The magic flute has dialogues in between the music, and so instead of having people speak them, the dialogue was shown on the screen just the way it was in the silent movies. This brilliant production is by Barry Kosky. It's one of the great directors of our time. And this is just to show you how different that looks, for instance, from the first slides you saw. And if we move on to the next slide, you will see another aspect of that with opulent use of lighting effects and the use of projections to create musical space, to create dramatic space. Here's another, we move on to the next slide. Here's another approach. Also Mozart, this is an opera, the Abductio, which is a wonderful opera, which is played less often than it should be. It's a comedy, but it's like all Mozart. It is a sublime comedy that touches on great human values, the value of love, the value of honesty, the value of compassion and forgiveness. So it was originally placed in a palace in Turkey in the original conception. But here it's transposed into the 20th century on the Orient Express. And so you actually see the train, the moving train, during the course of the opera, and the scenes take place on that train with the costuming, we'll call it style of Agatha Christie. If you move on to the next slide, you'll see a close-up of that. And it's the kind of approach. So we are not distancing the audience all the way back to the end of the 18th century when Mozart wrote this opera, but we are bringing it closer to our own time. So now if we move on to the next slide, This is a special production which we do once a year in a cathedral. Now, this was an innovation I brought to Los Angeles when I started as music director in 2006. What is it? It is an opportunity for the whole community to participate in a theatrical experience of opera or oratorio or passion play. This is an opera, Noah's Flood, written by Benjamin Britten, which is a brilliantly written piece that combines a professional orchestra, a student orchestra, split up into beginners and more developed players. It has an amateur choir. It requires many children to sing in the production, and then some professional singers. And it's a story of Noah's flood, but not exactly as it is in the Bible, but more as it was in a passion play, or the Chester plays, which were plays that were originally performed in the front of a cathedral on a square. And these were actually the first operas. What were they? They were biblical stories, and they were sung, partially sung, completely sung, and gradually out of that experience, what we know as opera today began to grow. And Benjamin Britten used, in a way, that old form, but of course, in modern 20th century terms. So we put on this production in this magnificent cathedral, which is close to our home at the Music Center in Los Angeles. And this Benjamin Britten opera is so popular that we fill up that cathedral once a year. Tickets cost $1. There are never tickets available. I would say some 85,000 people have come to see these plays over the years already. We now perform the Britten Noah's Flood on alternative years, and we commission works or make up our own new works, which are based on the same principle, which is to say the whole community, students, amateurs, professionals, all together, and that's a symbolic act as well as a musical theatrical work. Here's one more picture for you to see, and that is there. Oh, I'm sorry, there's more than one. Here I am rehearsing. You can see them in the cathedral. You can't see the cathedral so well here, but you see the amateur choir. You see working with them separately from the orchestra and chorus. And then if we move on to the next. This is an opera, Moses, by Henry Morricone, which we have commissioned, and it's based on the same principle as Benjamin Britten. All of the same elements, chamber orchestra of professionals, a large orchestra for students, and amateur choir, and most important, lots of children. Now, we've been doing this long enough for me now to get great pleasure out of seeing students who were students come to me in professional settings, said, by the way, I was in Noah's Flood at the cathedral in Los Angeles, and now I'm a lawyer. Now I'm a doctor. Now I play in an orchestra. Now I sing professionally. All of those things together. So on to the next slide. Before every performance at Los Angeles Opera, I talk to the audience for 45 minutes. We start an hour before the performance, and we talk right up to 15 minutes of the performance, which gives everybody an opportunity to go to their seats. Then I go through all of the dressing rooms. I say hi to all the singers, say hello, good luck, last minute consultations. And then I go to the orchestra pit and the performance starts. This has become a tradition now in Los Angeles Opera. I enjoy this very, very, very much because it gives me a direct contact with the audience. And I talk about the music, I talk about the opera, I put it in a historical context, something that will help emphasize the experience for the audience, many of whom are coming to that particular opera first time, some of course who are coming to an opera for the first time. And I think the reason that this has become so popular is because people really like context. They like to understand what an opera is, why the piece of music is so important. So those talks are about music. They are not about singers. I don't tell a lot of stories about what happens backstage or anything. Telling you a little bit today, but so what else does a music director, together with the managing director or the chief operating orchestra, artistic director of opera company, whatever it may be. I work very closely with my colleague Christopher Kirsch. How do you choose repertory? How do you choose the pieces you're going to perform? First of all, you can't do everything every year, so you try to balance your choice of operas over a 5-year period. So that should include a certain amount of Italian opera, a certain amount of German opera, a certain amount of French opera, Anglo-Saxon opera, so I talk about English opera and American opera, a certain amount of Russian opera, very important opera, for instance, the Czech operas of Janacek and Dvorak. Spanish opera or Zarzuela has another place in all of that. So you balance it in that respect because you want to give your audience a wide breadth of ideas. You want to break it up into periods of music. That is to say, as 17th century opera started at we give it a date around 1597, but the first opera we identify as popular was Monteverdi's 1607. It started in Florence, and it started out as a part of the Renaissance. The idea was going back to Greek myths that everybody knew and finding this new form of expression that included singing. So we want some old opera, so to speak, Baroque opera from the 18th century, early 18th century, classical opera, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven in the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. Then a great deal with the opera in the height of composition during the 19th century. You get the 19th century opera, and there you get giants like Giuseppe Verdi, like Gioacchino Rossini, later Giacomo Puccini in the Italian wing. You get giants like Richard Wagner, later Richard Strauss in the German wing. You have French opera with giants like Georges Bizet, Claude Debussy, who wrote one opera, but it's a very great opera. You have the Grand Opera, that was the form of opera that was very popular. As its title suggests, it was very heavy on spectacle. That was the operas of Meyerbeer. And then we move into the 20th century, where the German opera continues to have great protagonists, Alban Berg, of course, being one of them. Some of the composers who were suppressed during the years of Nazi Germany, like Alexander Zemlinsky, Franz Schreker, these are also very important works, although we don't hear them as much as we should. And the 20th century goes forward, and now we're in the modern era. What was modern when I was studying one of the great composers, Benjamin Britten, the great British composer, that was modern. Now that's considered 20th century music, and we have contemporary opera going right up until 2020. So our job is to produce all of that. Can't do it all in one season, obviously, so I look at it over 5-year spans. So that's part of what a conductor like me, as a music director, that's my function. But as a conductor, my greatest pleasure, my greatest moment is when I'm in front of the orchestra, in the pit in an opera house or on the stage in concert live, in front of an audience like you. And what I'd love to emphasize to you is everybody is included in classical music. You don't have to have an education. There is no snobbery about music. Music is not snobbish. Some people who have been music fans or audiences act like snobs, but they're to be ignored. The humanity that is behind these operas is the humanity that has to do with you and me and everybody else. And that's what this great music is all about. Now, one of my experiences, I do speak a lot in public, is that I'll talk for a certain amount of time, as I just have, a half an hour or so, and then I open the floor to questions. And I'm always interested in the questions because most of the time, or often the time, the questions has nothing to do with anything I talked about. So I'm looking forward to the surprising questions now that you've been kind enough to send in. I'm going to ask my colleague and friend, Fran, there. Are you out there, Fran?
I'm here. Thank you, Maestro. That was a wonderful talk.
And Fran, I know you have a lot of questions, and so fire away and I'll try to answer them.
Well, the first question I want to pass along to you is from Kathy in Garden City. Thank you for your presentation. I have never been to an opera. As a newcomer to this art, what opera would you suggest I see first?
Hard answer, because in a certain way, I mean, people often ask me, what's my favorite opera? I can't answer that question. I have so many. But I would pick something. It's really hard to answer that question because I'm surprised. Sometimes people come to operas that are considered to be difficult and they love them. For instance, we had teenage students coming to the Ring of Wagner. That's considered very daunting, and they're very long, and they were fascinated and thrilled and became opera fans. Anything is a good opera for the first time as long as the performance is good. That's why performance standards have to be very high. I happened to see La Traviata for the first time, which is a very popular opera, when I was 11. Then I saw the Barber of Seville, which really changed my life. After that, all I could do is I wanted to hear Rossini and the Barber of Seville. I saw Mozart very early. The operas of Mozart are great. The so-called romantic operas, these are great love stories full of passion and everything that goes with it. These are the great melodramas of the 19th century. Giuseppe Verdi is a great way to go for a first opera. Mozart is a great way to go for first opera. If you like comic opera, Rossini is a great way to go. But I could throw you right into so-called heavy opera, long opera like Wagner, and you might love it from the first time. For instance, I brought my mother, who was not a musician, to see Parsifal, reputed to be a very difficult opera to listen to. First of all, it's 4 hours more plus a time. And at the time, there were no surtitles. Now there are surtitles, and you know everything everybody's saying. And I remember my mother transfixed. Can't even remember how old she was by that time. She had never seen it. She loved this opera. She sat there transfixed. Didn't speak German, didn't know the text, could only guess at the meaning of the opera, and it was a great opera. So anything's good, and if you find you like it, you'll come again to another opera. If you find you don't like it, come again anyway, because opera grows on each successive hearing. That's why I can hear certain operas 100, 200 times. There are operas that I've conducted almost 100 times. And so it's an art form, as is classical music, whether it's Beethoven, Brahms, in a concert, or Verdi or Wagner or Puccini in an opera house. It grows every time you hear it.
Fantastic. I think you might have answered this a little bit earlier in your talk, but you've helped me in this more than you know. Janet from St. Catharines wants to know, how would you introduce children to opera?
I would bring them myself, that is to say, the parents should go with the child, and bring them as early as they're able to sit still. And more importantly, I would say, play music at home. If you're not a musician, that's fine. Just find either the classical radio stations or online, because everything is online. And just have children listen to classical music when they're very, very young, and without no lectures, no explaining. This is high culture. This is something you need to learn. To have them hear it and by osmosis, so that it comes into their ears and their brains without any of the baggage that later gets loaded onto the experience of classical music and the experience of the association of going to concerts. And then I would bring them to comic operas at first. I saw the Barber of Seville. That's great. Any Rossini opera is a great way to start. The experience in our cathedral, even the cathedral operas were a great way to start for many children. The important thing is you do it together.
That's great. This is a good one. John from San Diego wants to know, do conductors usually have to be in good physical shape? What is the most exhausting opera you have been involved with producing?
Well, one of the great things about conducting is that it keeps you in shape. I, right now with COVID, have to make sure that I exercise and walk every day. Fortunately, I'm in an area where I can walk and not be close to other people, as long as I have my mask on and I keep my distance, because that is my main. It's not sufficient, shouldn't be your only form of conducting, but conducting is very strenuous. It's very good for your heart circulatory system. It's very good for your musculature. So opera conducting, which is even more strenuous than orchestral concerts, is a great way to stay in shape. The answer is yes, we should be in shape. And I find that it's part of being in shape. Just conducting is just doing it.
That's great. Shelton and...
Sorry, I didn't answer the second question. What's the most exhausting opera? Well, I would say the longest the longest I've conducted without stopping, because stopping is a big issue, is the first opera, the first music drama of Wagner's Ring, Das Rheingold. It's about 2 hours and 40 minutes without stopping. But some of it isn't physically strenuous. The hardest opera I know from the point of view of endurance is The Flying Dutchman by Wagner, which is approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes of music nonstop and very intense. That is, I would say, the biggest challenge that I think of when I think of this question.
Great. Shelton from Silver Springs wants to know, what particular composition has been the most challenging to conduct from before an orchestra? What is it about the composition that made it difficult?
Hard question to answer, because the difficulties are very varied. You know, let's take Mozart, Haydn. People say, well, that's not difficult music. No, it's not, but it is very transparent music, and it has to be perfectly performed and executed, because the audience or listener can hear anything wrong with it because it's so transparent. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, we have in contemporary works of great complexity, rhythmic complexity, thick contrasting lines. Just the coordination is difficult. Those are two ends of the spectrum. And the fact is, one of my great colleagues once said, somebody was saying, well, isn't that an easy opera? And he answered, I don't know an easy opera. In fact, the challenges of doing something well render everything difficult, but at the same time, the challenges of doing it well render it interesting and impassioning.
That's great. Thank you. Art from Tucson, Arizona wants to know, have you ever had the orchestra on the stage?
Well, the answer, yeah, several answers to that question. First of all, yes, all the time when you conduct concerts. So I assume that you mean, have I ever had the orchestra of an opera on the stage? The answer is yes. There's something we refer to as concert opera, and it's just that. All the singers' orchestra are on the stage. There is no pit, and it's an alternative way of experiencing an opera. Why do I say that? First of all, I believe very much in its value, not as a substitute for opera productions, but for the fact that the audience hears an opera differently first of all, when they can hear everything that's going on in the orchestra, and they can become more involved on a direct level with the power of the music. Opera is music drama. The music is an integral part of the drama, and the drama is an integral part of the music. I say to conducting students who I work with, I say, look, they want to say, well, how do you conduct an opera? I said, well, you can't explain that in 20 minutes, but I would say one thing: you have to be an excellent conductor. You have to know how to conduct. There are many conductors who are great orchestral conductors that aren't comfortable in the opera house, or they don't like the art form. And so my message is, if you don't love drama, if you don't love theater, if you don't love language, if you don't love the human voice, then stay away from opera. But if you do love it, and I've gone astray a little bit from your question, there are many ways to experience it. And operas in concert, I feel, are a very, very valid alternative to opera in production.
Excellent. Let's see, here's a good one. John from Jackson Hole, Wyoming wants to know, how do you balance allowing freedom of expression from your orchestra members and their craft while also providing leadership and direction for the piece as a whole?
That's a great question, and you live in a beautiful place in Jackson Hole. I've actually conducted there, a wonderful orchestra that is there in the summers. So there are many different viewpoints on what the conductor's function is, and so I think if you ask that question of 10 conductors, you'll get 10 different answers. So I have my own personal philosophy. My own personal philosophy is, number one, remember that you do not make a sound, that the orchestra members, the individual members, all have to play their instruments in order for there to be music. And so your first job is like the doctor. First, do no harm. Get out of their way in the sense of let them not just perform on their instrument, but let them express themselves while they do it. And so I think that leads me to the first answer, or the first aspect of that answer is as an inspiring presence. My job, I feel, is essentially to inspire everybody to A, play their best, and B, participate in a communal experience. You can enjoy yourself playing your instrument by yourself, but there are things you can't do by yourself, and you cannot play great symphonies by yourself. You have to do it as a part of a community. You can sing to yourself, by yourself, but if you want to experience what it means to sing great choral music, you have to sing in a choir or in a chorus. So I try to inspire everybody to feel unified. And bearing in mind, you have anywhere between 3,500 individuals, each one of them who knows music and feels music in their separate ways. You hope to inspire them to feel the same thing at the same moment. And in that regard, the conductor is a center of gravity. It used to be expressed very much in authoritarian terms. The conductor demands, the players obey. That's a very old-fashioned way of viewing things. I view it as it is a community of equal human beings, each one of us with our function. The oboe has to play the oboe. The first violins play the first violin part, the second violins play the second violin part, and everybody is important. The brass instruments, the percussion, everybody is important, everybody is essential. The conductor is just in the center of it, coordinating it all, and trying not just to coordinate in terms of the sounds, but to somehow or other find a common spiritual feeling about the music at that time. I believe that music is a spiritual force. I believe that classical music is a very powerful spiritual force, and I try to communicate that through the orchestra to an audience.
That's great. A comment more than a question. Thank you from Janine in Basking Ridge. Thank you for your most interesting presentation during COVID-19 since March 16th. I've watched 120 operas from the Metropolitan Opera. Tonight will be my 121st. Your presentation was most enlightening. So thank you. I think the sentiment cuts across many of these questions. Let's see, let's find another question from Lewis in San Diego. Did you or do you have a mentor? And do you have any words of advice for someone looking to follow in your footsteps?
Well, if you mean conducting, hard to give advice long distance. I would give the same advice to any music lover or any practicing musician. I would say, if you love classical music, if you learn to love classical music, or I should say, if you're lucky enough to love it, because it is a great life, then you can pursue it professionally. You have to practice a lot. You have to learn a lot. You have to practice constantly. You have to study constantly. You will so all your life. Don't do all of that unless you have a real passion, unless you really can't live without it. Now, for those of you, if you mean following my footsteps as a person who loves music, that's easy. All you have to do is listen. And I believe that if you listen on a consistent basis, it will grow and it will lead you to where you need to go. I don't say everybody has to be a professional. Not everybody should be a professional. We don't need that many professionals. But what we do need everywhere are people with whom we can share it and who can listen and listen with love. Because if you're not out there to listen, our function isn't as interesting at all. So if you want to be a conductor, you should master at least one instrument, and you should study everything you can. There's nothing that is irrelevant to know about music. And consequently, if you're going to be interested in opera, about the human voice, about languages, about theater, there's nothing that is not useful in contributing to your preparation to be a conductor.
Okay, I think we have time for a few more questions. Jenny from Pasadena asks, would you say that conductors have a style in which they approach their work? And if so, how does your style of conducting differ from that of other conductors?
Very good question. First of all, the answer has to be there are many, many different styles, almost as many styles as people. Nobody's learned how to actually bottle a magic potion that makes a conductor. Conductors are a combination of having to be musicians, accomplished musicians, but having a personality that is able to inspire or simply to convince people to make music their way at that moment. There are as many styles. It's a very individual thing. There are schools of conducting, but not the same way there are great schools of pianism and string playing that go back centuries. They tend to be, the schools are varied because it's such an individual art. And so, yes, obviously my style is my style. I had a teacher, I had a great teacher. His name was Jean Morel. He was a Frenchman who taught at Juilliard in the 50s. Well, I studied at the end of the 60s, early 70s. He was a great, I've had very many mentors in the sense of anybody you watch becomes a mentor to you. So I learned from watching. I was lucky enough to grow up in New York City, where you could go to a lot of concerts. I watched every conductor and orchestra, either the New York Philharmonic or the Metropolitan Opera, or all the visiting orchestras that came through the city. So I could watch a lot of as a teenager. I learned a lot without ever having conducted, just by watching. So it's a very varied art, and that's the beauty of it, that everybody's different.
Okay. This might be a crystal ball type question from Robert in Summit. How will COVID affect the future of opera, do you think?
Well, first of all, it's much too early to answer. I wouldn't make any predictions about any walk of life because this is a profound experience for the entire world. It's been compared to a war. It's like a world war. It is something that is, because it's going to affect the whole globe, and we are at the beginning, or closer to the beginning than we are to the end, I believe. We don't know how that's going to play out. I can expect that we're going to learn things in the process of living through it that are going to be maybe interesting creative paths that we may follow, that we will have discovered in opera, in concert making. Now, one of the things is the importance of streaming, the importance of being able to communicate with audiences and the public, just as you and I are doing today, over Skype, over Zoom. I think that's going to become more important. And I think that also probably the imaginative use of those means of Zoom, Skype, streaming can be integrated to a greater degree in the presentation of concerts and opera. We don't know where it's going to lead. And also, I think the maybe an even more profound question is, how are we going to learn as a human community, the entire world, not just our country, not just our state, not just our city, not just our continent? How are we all going to learn and to have an even deeper relationship with each other? Nothing can be done individually, that we are all tied together on this planet, and we have to take care of each other. We have to take care of the planet, and we have to do that as an enormous family. This, I believe, will have to sink in more deeply because of COVID. And so that's going to make musicians, artists, dancers, writers, that's going to affect their art and how they present their art and how they feel, what they think. And so I think all of that is yet to be seen, and I think that's going to be a very long process. And I hope it's a very creative and a constructive. I have found that this time, what am I doing constructively for my public, or my audience, or people that are not my audience, while I cannot conduct? Well, I am making podcasts, lots of them, one a week, which we produce and can be found on the LA Opera website. And why? Because it's a way that I can speak directly to the public about the subjects that mean a lot to me in the opera. For instance, I've done a 7-part series on the Figaro operas of Mozart, Rossini, John Corigliano, the operas that are based on the works of Beaumarchais, the French, the extraordinary French playwright, author, philosopher, politician. I have a 5-part series on Debussy's only opera, Pelléas and Mélisande. Why? Because we were going to produce it. It was one of the operas that was canceled. So there's a 5-part series. I am now working on The Ring, because we're going to rebroadcast our performances from 10 years ago. And I think I will probably continue to do this because it's something creative that I can do. Speaking about music is not making music exactly, but it's related to it. And so I found creativity, and I think it's very important for everybody to be creative in this time, find things that we can safely do for the moment, with respecting physical distance and wearing masks and doing everything that is going to slow down the progress of this virus until it can be defeated by medicine, by vaccines. Being creative, and for me personally, I would encourage all of you to make music a part of your life at home. I can't live long enough to hear and rehear all the music I love, and music can be an inspiration. Music can be a great pleasure on a daily basis, and all you have to do is turn on your computer these days or your radio. You can have it right in your home. Your children, your family can have it right in the home. I encourage everybody. Of course, I'm a classical musician and believe in it and love it. But whatever music is your music, listen to it. But I'd love to see people, especially people who don't have an experience with classical music, using this COVID experience to make it a part of your lives on an everyday basis.
Okay, one last question for you, Maestro Conlon. If people want to hear more of your podcasts and the wonderful segments that you have on LA Opera, is it at laopera.org? Is that where they can find it?
It is, and there's a corner of James Conlon now.
Great.
So I think if you dig around, you'll find it.
Excellent. Do you have any parting words for the audience? Anything about opera that they may not know, that they may not recognize as they anticipate looking at more or experiencing more?
Well, my parting words are, I wish I could see you. I know you can see me. I wish I could be on a Viking cruise someday, as I gather most of you have been or will be at another time. I'm very grateful to Viking for making this possible, and very particular my friend Fran. We used to be colleagues at the LA Opera. I would just reiterate what I just said. Thank you for attending today. Make music a part of your life. I wish I could see you. I hope that I will be able to meet you in person at Los Angeles Opera or anywhere in the world, wherever you happen to be. And I wish you well. Stay safe, stay healthy, together with your families and friends until we've all come through this together.
Thank you, Maestro.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.